Today's topic is Hirschsprung disease with respect to historical aspects, evolution in the concepts of diagnosis and management. The literature related to therapy of congenital megacolon Hirschsprungs is rather chaotic and difficult to evaluate. So we'll first go through the first 60 years of confusion that was there in literature with respect to Hirschsprung's disease from 1886, the first formal description, to 1946. Early descriptions were as early as 1691, where the first description of megacolon was described by Dutch surgeon Ruisch, and the earliest autopsy finding was noted by Parry in 1825. Following that, the major description was done by Harold Hirschsprung, whose name the disease has now. In 1826, Harold was born. In 1861, he described, other than Hirschsprung's disease, he has given a lot more contribution in the field of pediatric surgery. He was a practicing pediatrician. In 1861, 4 cases of tracheoesophageal fistula and esophageal atresia cases were described. In 1876, he described the controlled hydrostatic reduction of an ileocolic intussusception. And the major description was in January 1886. He gave a talk on constipation in newborns due to dilatation and hypertrophy of the colon to the prestigious Society of Pediatrics in Berlin. In 1888, he described 2 cases of congenital diaphragmatic hernia. In 1904, the same talk got published into a textbook chapter, and 1916, he died at the age of 86. So when he first described Hirschsprung's disease as constipation in newborn due to dilatation and hypertrophy of the colon, there was no definite opinion as to the etiology or the treatment of the disease. It was described as a new rare congenital condition in infants and children, and this conformed to the malformation theory because he believed it to be congenital. He noted the narrow rectosigmoid region, but he did not understand its significance, and the focus was mainly on the dilated proximal colon, and they thought the entire colon was congenitally defective. So the early theories of pathophysiology were broadly 3. Malformation theory. In 1894, Meyer wrote that the hypertrophied colon was the primary congenital defect, and this was the popular opinion at the time. Also, in 1978, obstruction theory came into play, where Trevis said that dilated colon was due to a mechanical blockage from the redundant colon or the rectal valves. In 1900, Fenwick proposed that the distal colon was contracted in a spasm and caused a functional obstruction, and this was the spastic theory. So in the 1890s, with these theories in mind, there were several possible therapeutic options that they described. In 1893, Osler described 2 cases where that the defect was in the innervation and contraction of the colon, and he treated them with colostomy and rectal tube irrigations. One of the cases colostomy and the other tube rectal tube irrigations, and found good results. And Meyer introduced the term congenital megacolon for these cases. Marfan in 1975 relieved another case of long redundant sigmoid by passage of a rectal tube. And over towards the end of 1898 and 1902, multiple authors described symptomatic relief by separate case reports of colonic obstruction, by colonic irrigations, or by colostomy. So these 2 became the popular treatment at the time. In 1898, Trevis performed colostomy in a 5-year-old girl with lifelong constipation and obstruction, relieved her signs and symptoms, and also went ahead to do a second operation to cure her by resecting all the proximal dilated colon, the narrow rectosigmoid, and also the anus. He was quite radical with the resection, and it led to an incontinent perineal colostomy. In the 1900s, the first case reports of absent ganglion cells were described. In 1900, Fenwick described an abnormally tight anal sphincter due to spastic rectal contraction. So this was a mechanical obstruction causing the proximal colon to dilate. Bayliss and Starling did a study on peristalsis through the colon and its autonomic nervous supply. This further shed some light on possible pathophysiology. In 1901, Tittel first gave the histological report on absence of intramural ganglion cells in the rectum of a 15-month-old infant. So with this background, Wilms in 1918 tried an anal sphincter dilatation to treat Hirschsprung's. Dallowell was the first one to report total absence of ganglion cells from rectosigmoid in 1920. So with the Wade and Royal tried lumbar sympathectomy and rectosigmoid myotomy. All these were tried in the early 1920s. But there were many contradicting reports in the outcomes with all the options at the time, and the general opinion was that the outlook was poor, whatever the treatment, and it was axiomatic to say that no one has ever been permanently cured of this condition. In 1938, Robertson and Kernohan from the Mayo Clinic they described absence of ganglion cells in the rectosigmoid and correctly correlated it with proximal colonic obstruction in infancy. But from the same Mayo Clinic in 1943, Whitehouse, Bargan, and Dixon, they reviewed the results of all various treatments, but they believed that absent ganglion cells was secondary after following proximal dilatation, and they thought it could be ischemic in cause, and they advocated segmental resection of the dilated proximal colon as the best treatment, and their mortality rate at the time was 24%. In 1945, Grimson, Vandegrift, and Datz proposed that subtotal colectomy and ileosigmoidostomy was the best treatment of Hirschsprung's, and this also failed. So, the summary of the early treatments based on the malformation theory, small and large resection of the proximal dilated colon was tried. Obstruction was relieved with rectal tubes and enemas and dilatation, even a myotomy. Based on the spastic neuromuscular theory, parasympathomimetic drugs were tried, electric enemas, spinal anesthesia, and lumbar sympathectomy was tried. So in 1943, Iphigenius attempted to define this disease as a dysfunctional evacuation of the colon as of yet unknown origin occurring in the absence of morphological and mechanical causation, giving rise secondarily to a characteristic dilatation of the colon, and he was very true in saying so. Um, By 1946, several authors had published their results showing aganglionic changes in the Auerbach's plexus in the rectosigmoid and found its pathologic significance. However, Iphigenius was the first to appreciate that this was the primary cause. In 1946, Swenson and Bill established for the first time that narrow rectosigmoid with no ganglion cells were the cause of the disease by an elaborate description. With this concept, the treatment of choice was a resection of this aganglionic segment. So in 1948, Swenson's pull-through came into existence. Swenson and Bill gave a talk in the Society of University of Surgeons that radiographic and balloon manometry they used to demonstrate the area of spasm and lack of peristalsis in the rectosigmoid. So the first absolute concrete evidence that etiology was defective narrow segment was given by them. They also presented a curative operative technique plus a temporary colostomy to manage this. Initially, this technique was done as experiments on dogs where the entire rectum and appropriate lengths of dilated proximal bowel were removed. They preserved the internal anus sphincter for continence. Following the seeing results in dogs, they did this procedure successfully in a child with Hirschsprung's disease. In 1948, Whitehouse and Kernohan they examined they performed post-mortem examinations in 11 children who also died of megacolon. They conclusively established the pathology of narrow rectosigmoid and absence of ganglion cells. And Swenson and Pickett, along with their radiological colleague Neuhauser, they first published the barium enema technique for diagnosis. They demonstrated narrow sigmoid rectum, sigmoid and distal colon and a transition zone on its way to the dilated proximal colon. So this became the standard diagnostic test for Hirschsprung's disease. In 1949, Swenson, Rhinelander, and Diamond they described that the narrow rectosigmoid had no peristalsis, abnormally high intraluminal pressure based on manometry findings, that it was aganglionic and caused physiological functional obstruction. And by the Cannon's law, which was earlier described in 1934, which stated that smooth muscle remains contracted when denervated. So they applied the same to these in Hirschsprung's disease and concluded that Hirschsprung's disease could be cured by removal of this defective rectosigmoid. So after 1950s, the core concept of defective rectosigmoid was established, and focus was on modifications of the anastomotic method used for surgery or removal and bypass of the aganglionic segment. Just a moment. It was unlocked when I started. I am the host. It's got locked. The meeting has been unlocked. In 1951, he had performed some manometric studies, again demonstrated narrow spastic contracted rectosigmoid, and lack of normal reflex relaxation of the internal anus sphincter was first described. And recurrence following inadequate resection of distal aganglionic segment was noted. So in 1967, Schnoffner and co-authors reported absence of internal anal sphincter relaxation as the most important criteria in manometric diagnosis of Hirschsprung's disease. In 1955, Swenson, Fisher, and McMahon, they introduced the rectal biopsy as a precise, complication-free test to establish the diagnosis. It was done under general anesthesia. They removed about 0.5 to 1 centimeter full thickness section of the posterior rectal wall, about 3 centimeters from the mucocutaneous junction, and this needed a two-layer closure. And histopathology showed they would search for ganglion cells in the intermuscular nerve plexus, and presence of ganglion cells ruled out the diagnosis of Hirschsprung's. They also noted that a very low biopsy would lead to falsely negative results. So in smaller children, they adopted at least 1 centimeter above the pectinate line or the dentate line, and then in older children, they performed up to 3 to 4 centimeters above. In 1960, Bodian established diagnosis by a smaller rectal biopsy where only submucosa and mucosa were taken in the biopsy to search for ganglion cells in the submucosal plexus. In 1961, Shandling introduced the punch biopsies of valve of Houston using laryngeal biopsy forceps. He modified posterior rectal wall biopsy was done, and no anesthesia was necessary in newborns, infants, and some older children, and there was no requirement for closure of the biopsy site. In 1965, Dobbins and Bill described the rectal suction biopsy as a reliable method of diagnosis. And in this, they also combined usage of histochemical staining of excess acetylcholine esterase, which was associated with increased number of hypertrophic nerve trunks. In 1956, Duhamel described a pull-through technique for definitive surgery. It was a posterior colorectal side-to-side anastomosis just above the internal sphincter, and a crushing clamp was left in situ to crush the colorectal septum or the spur or the common wall, which would result by this anastomosis. He used 2 Cocker clamps with their handles sticking out of the rectum, and this would fall out in about 10 to 14 days. And this procedure was done to leave the rectal mucosa behind because it was believed to be important for sensation, preservation of sensation, and it was also to decrease injury to pelvic nerves from perirectal dissection. In 1958, Rehbein modified this. He described an anterior resection technique, a lower resection with anastomosis 3 to 4 centimeter from the mucocutaneous line, and this was limited only to about 3 months of age. So it was a classic low anterior resection done entirely within the pelvis, and internal sphincter also was dilated to overcome obstructive tendency of the remaining aganglionic rectum, which was seen in some post-op cases of Duhamel pull-through. In 1959, there was another modification where posterior anastomostic incision was further raised to 2 to 2.5 centimeter above mucocutaneous line to preserve the entire internal sphincter. But patients suffered from constipation, and often there was fecaloma formation in the residual blind anterior pouch. So they again modified Duhamel technique by shortening the anterior rectal pouch and minimizing the occurrence of fecaloma. In 1962, there was another modification by Martin and Altemeyer, where the lengthening of the anastomosis was done by side-to-side attachment of the rectum to the colon. Then Martin further modified this technique in 1967, where rectum was left in place and utilized in the fecal stream with minimal pelvic dissection. So they did a low-level anastomosis. This is how the post-operative picture looked like. There were again further modifications in 1968. Soper and Miller described to eliminate a common postoperative anatomic and functional problem, which was the residual septum, which caused anterior fecaloma, as we described earlier. So they opened the top of the residual anterior rectum from the abdomen to make sure the Cocker's clamp had completely eliminated the colorectal septum without a spur. Another modification was using disposable sterile preloaded staples instead of Cocker's clamp to eliminate this spur. This was known to be fast, safe, and immediate cutting was done between two rows of metallic clips, similar to the staples we know now, to eliminate the septum. In 1964, Swenson published a review with his technique of some first 100 cases. He reported postoperative enterocolitis, and some of them required sphincterotomy to reduce the constipation. And probably the cause was too much residual distal rectum uh, when he did an anastomosis 3 to 4 centimeter above the mucocutaneous line. So he modified his own technique, converted to 2 centimeter anteriorly and 0.5 to 1 centimeter posteriorly, thus removing a bit of the posterior internal sphincter to avoid constipation, and the incidence of postoperative enterocolitis requiring sphincterotomy was reduced. Then came into existence the Suave procedure. He modified the original Swenson procedure by submucosal dissection. He removed mucosa of the aganglionic rectosigmoid starting 8 centimeter above the peritoneal reflection and descending down to about 1 centimeter above the mucocutaneous line. So an endorectal pull through of the proximal colon was done through this residual rectosigmoid muscular cuff, and he left the bowel protruding, that is the telescoping bowel was left protruding 5 to 10 centimeter below the anus, so that adhesions developed between the two walls. And after this, later, secondarily, he went in and amputated the prolapsed bowel by cautery in about 15 to 20 days time. So the severed edge spontaneously withdrew into the anal canal a few hours or immediately with slight finger pressure. And the principal advantage of this technique was the ease of performance and minimal pelvic dissection involved. There were further Bully's modification of Suave procedure where trimming of the proximal colon at the original operation site was done primarily, and he performed an anorectal anastomosis initially itself. In 1971, Kasai, Suzuki, and Watanabe, they both did a longitudinal myotomy of the aganglionic segment and the muscular cuff, and higher anorectal anastomosis was done as a modification to Suave problem to eliminate some of the cuff stenosis problems that were there. So there was focus on preservation of internal sphincter with all these techniques at that time. In 1970, Frenius reported that the principal complication of all operative procedures related to internal sphincter. If too much internal sphincter damage was done, it resulted in fecal incontinence, and if more of the sphincter remained, there were high chances of constipation and the other obstructive symptoms leading on to enterocolitis. So they erred towards keeping more of the sphincter, as fecal incontinence was more of a problem. Pages and Duhamel described a retrorectal incision in the middle of the internal anal sphincter, 1 to 1.5 centimeter above, to address this issue. Summary, Frenius in 1971 published a paper which summarized all the developments up till then. At that point of time, incidence was described to be 1 in 5,000 live births. They also noted the presence of hereditary occurrences, where they noted higher incidence of in siblings of an affected child, 3.5 times, where the general population had a risk of only about 0.8%. They also noted that there was heterogeneous etiology, that is the multifactorial causation, and the main feature was absence of spontaneous bowel evacuation as the clinical feature, and diagnosis was by barium enema and rectal biopsy. He also went ahead to classify megacolon, as there was a lot of confusion with idiopathic megacolon and what could be recognized as Hirschsprungs. So he did two broad categories based on histopathology: abnormal ganglion cells and normal ganglion cells. And in those which had abnormal ganglion cells with known mechanisms, Hirschsprungs was one of them, with aganglionosis or hypoganglionosis. Other causes of acquired megacolon were like Chagas disease in South America, complications of anorectal surgeries, immaturity, they saw that in premature babies, and other symptomatic megacolon like strictures, neurological disorders. And those with normal ganglion cells and unknown mechanisms, they termed it idiopathic megacolon or psychogenic megacolon, though the term of some preferred the term of chronic constipation and achalasia of the distal rectosigmoid and pseudo Hirschsprung's disease. These were all the synonyms used for the same entity. And summary of the treatments that were available, the main objective of treatment was to relieve obstruction temporarily in emergencies in case of ileus and enterocolitis, and this they did by colostomy. This was standard practice, and definitive surgeries were done following that. This shows summary of all the four popular surgeries that were available. The Swenson's technique with coloanal anastomosis, the Duhamel technique, anterior resection, and the endorectal pull-through. So he had a synopsis of physiological achievements of these operations, where radical resection was not seen in anterior resection, and they preserved rectal sensation, Duhamel anterior resection and endorectal, whereas Swenson had more of radical resection and however had adequate sphincter division. In their clinical achievements, early and late mortality combined, the overall mortality was high with Swenson's, and so was leak, stricture, constipation, and anal incontinence. All of them were higher, and lowest. And anterior resection, however, had high chance of constipation. Duhamel had issues related with the rectal pouch. So in 1980 to 1990, a small series of successful one-stage pull-through operations were described. However, the contraindications were cases of infants with enterocolitis and all that did not require diverting colostomy, and its efficacy and safety were proven with multiple case reports. So, two of the prevailing theories of pathogenesis evolved at this time in between 1980 and 1990. That is the failure of migration of stem cells from their neural crest niche and involution. The other thing they believed is involution of failure of differentiation of these stem cells once they arrived at their terminal location. Martusiello and colleagues identified the first Hirschsprung's genetic defect for a sporadic case of Hirschsprung's, that is the interstitial deletion of long arm of chromosome between 10q 11.2 and 10q 21.2. Then came the laparoscopic approach. Georgeson and colleagues first described the new gold standard of laparoscopic approach for endorectal pull-through, that is SWAV pull-through in 1999. The advantages were clearly that it reduced perioperative complications and postoperative recovery time, and the ease at which this transition zone could be identified was highlighted, and mesenteric dissection was performed. And this, after identification of transition zone, they also used histopathology to definitively determine the transition zone. In 1998, animal models for genetic studies for aganglionosis was done. They described the white fold syndrome in horses, which was lethal, and it identified deletion mutation in endothelin B receptor gene as an important causative factor. In 98 and 99, a novel completely transanal approach was described. It utilizes a transanal approach through which rectal mucosectomy, distal aganglionic colectomy, and pull-through all three are performed. Jacob Langer postulated the benefit of staying out of the peritoneum as the potential advantages, with lower cost, less risk of damage to pelvic structures, lower incidence of intraperitoneal bleeding and adhesion formation, and absence of any abdominal scars. So Langer, Durant, and Dilla performed a multi-center review of 141 patients undergoing transanal pull-through. They reported comparable morbidity to the open procedures, less analgesia requirements, and shorter time to feed and discharge. There was increased incidence of stricture formation, however, and enterocolitis in the transanal pull-through group. Over the past 2 decades, in 2000, the American Pediatric Surgical Association reported mortality has declined from 70% in the 1954 to as little as 1% in 2000 because of more precise earlier diagnosis and aggressive, more effective surgical management. And since then, many genes and mutations have been identified, most notably red proto-oncogene, which is necessary for neural crest stem cell migration, and cell-derived neurotrophic factor, SOX10, SMAD interactive protein. In 2003, Proctor and colleagues presented information that warned surgeons against performing any pull-through without armed with only the radiological information, because 10% of long segment disease, the aganglionosis level was not correctly predicted by barium enema. So proper planning of surgery using biopsy to confirm the level of transition zone was highlighted. This timeline shows the overall, whatever we described till now, it's a brief summary of the same, with development of multiple techniques and with a drop in mortality to 1%. So I'd like to conclude Quoting what Swenson said, the surgeon who treats children who have Hirschsprung's disease assumes an enormous responsibility for the procedure he or she selects and his or her determination to provide long-term post-operative support while the patient is gaining control of the new rectum and adjusts to its as the new rectum adjusts to its new functions as a storage receptacle and will determine patient survival from this fatal disease and how normal the patient's intestinal function will be for the life expectancy of about 80 years. Thank you.
Yeah, at the outset, I would like to congratulate you because you really take pains. You don't really look at what is given in one book. I really loved the way you made your presentation well. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
A few things I wanted to highlight before others can pitch in is one that Hirschsprung is actually a diabetic pediatrician. Second thing is, I think he has also done a lot of work on pyloric stenosis. So, for describing pathology and all, I think Hirschsprung has done that well. Third thing I wanted to tell you was, even though we call modern medicine, it is as modern as if the first described procedure was in 1946. That means only about, say, 50, 60 years back. So, even though the disease entity existed for a long, long time, it has described, identified the problem, and we said this is the way it is. It's good. Ramchandra sir?
Yeah, nice presentation, Vidya. I like your style of presentation. A few things I want to point out. The pronunciation of Hirschsprung is sha with a soft sha. Hirschsprung. Okay,
Okay, sir.
that is how it should be presented. SCH is pronounced as sha. Sha.
Yes, sir.
Hirschsprung's. Okay, Hirschsprung's disease. That is how it should be pronounced. Not Hirschsprung's. Not sa. Sha.
Yes, sir.
So you have to carry this throughout your life as a pediatric surgeon. This pronunciation.
Yes,
Never
sir.
forget it.
Sure,
Sir?
sir.
My internet connection, there's some problem. Can you please tell the point that you made?
Hirschsprungs. The pronunciation of Hirschsprungs is with a sha, not with a sa.
Yes, sir.
Sha, sha.
The next is
Hirschsprungs.
it's not Hirschsprung apostrophe S. It's not the Hirschsprung that had the disease. So either put it as Hirschsprung disease or Hirschsprung. Okay.
Yes, sir.
And he was a Danish pediatrician from Copenhagen. He was a little bit of a rebel during his time. If you go through his biography, he was a little bit of a rebel. And he was appointed as a professor of pediatrics in one of the premier institutes. But he at that time refused to do much of private practice, but had to do it for the sake of surviving. But mostly he concentrated his efforts on looking at rare pediatric diseases, which was fortunate for us pediatric surgeons because he put the sort of torchlight on diseases like as Dr. Ramesh pointed out, pyloric stenosis, and as you pointed out, intussusception. At that time, he had the lowest mortality for intussusception. He used to reduce the intussusception himself hydrostatically. Whereas surgeons used to do the surgery and they used to have 80% mortality. And he this rheumatic disease and all that. So a lot of work he has done. Then other thing which you pointed out was about Heron Price. It is not Ephreinius. His name is Heron Price. Ehrepreis. Heron Price. He made remarkable contributions to the study of Hirschsprung's disease. You can go through his contributions and his references. Sorry. And one thing you completely forgot to mention was the contribution of Noblet to the uh, you know rectal biopsy. It is called as the Noblet forceps. The suction rectal biopsy forceps is called as Noblet forceps. And this lady is actually a radiologist from Australia. Okay. And then the other one is about you said Dila is actually dilatore. De La Torre, who did a lot of work on transanal pull-through, what is called as TEPT by us now.
Yes, sir.
And he did his animal experiments and proof of therapy concept. He presented to his hospital medical society, and his first patient was the child of a pediatrician who had Hirschsprung's disease. This was in Mexico, I think. He was a pediatric surgeon there, and he did the first transanal procedure in a human patient, and the mother was a pediatrician who had faith in De La Torre as a pediatric surgeon. Okay, that is how the surgery evolved, and he discharged the patient within 24 hours. The child behaved so well, and the mother was a pediatrician, and he discharged the patient within 24 hours. So that was the beauty of the transanal endorectal pull-through.
Yes, sir.
And interestingly, Orvar Svensson lived for 111 years. He was born in 1909 and he died in 2000 and odd. I don't know if you make the calculation. He 1909 or 19 something else, but he lived for 111 years. I know for sure. He survived for a very long time, and he had a very long retirement. This thing where he lived in a log cabin just in the wilderness in the US. His contributions basically are from Chicago Children's Hospital, Dr. Orvar Svensson. I have met him personally in LA Children's when he came, because one of his mentees, one of his proteges was Dr. Jordan Weitzman, who was a senior pediatric surgeon there, a very good surgeon. And he gave me a lot of, Dr. Weitzman gave me a lot of videos of Hirschsprung's surgery done through the Svensson's technique. I still have those videos with me. Thank you.
Ram sir, I'm sorry. Ram sir?
Yeah, tell me, Ramesh.
Yeah, you were telling about one of whose his mentee was?
Jordan Weitzman. 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 He's a Jewish guy, Jordan Weitzman, who worked with Svensson in Chicago.
Yes, sir.
He later came to LA Children's.
Of his Duhamel pull-through or Svensson pull-through. I think you had showed us.
Yeah, Svensson's. He always used to say Duhamel's is cheating. He would never accept Duhamel's. Whereas all the other guys used to do Duhamel's and Suave's there. And nobody would do Svensson's.
No, the same thing, sir. Srimurthy, R.K. Bagdi. I remember everybody saying it's a cheating. It's not the right thing. He discovered it only to do good.
But funnily, when Svensson gave us a grand rounds in LA Children's at the age of, I don't know, he must have been in his mid 80s or late 80s. He told us that his surgery was so precise and so difficult technically to do that there were enormous number of complications, and he accepted that the complication rate was very high with his surgery.
Yes, sir.
Technical complications, mortality, and post-operative problems with enterocolitis and all that. So, and all that was offset by the onset of, he acknowledged that Duhamel and Sauve made great contribution to the operative management of Hirschsprung's disease.
Very good, sir. But if a Duhamel is, Svensson is done well, it is really a treat to watch. I've seen.
It is.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
To the wall of the rectum, sir.
Correct.
Anybody else?